Welcome to The Criminologist, the podcast dedicated to educating and entertaining our listeners. We bring you subject matter experts from around the world and share the latest and greatest evidence-based practices and interventions to help individuals desist from a life of crime and delinquency. We do so by painting an accurate picture of that journey from the perspective of the justice-involved individual. Too often, our perceptions of those individuals are tainted by media-driven caricatures created to sell newspapers or movie tickets. This adds little to a healthy dialogue as to how to best address criminality and the reintegration process. This podcast avoids stereotypes and biases in favor of the lived experiences of those we can best learn from. Now, please, welcome the host of The Criminologist, Joseph Arvidsson.
Hello, and welcome to episode 78 of the Criminologist podcast. Happy to have you all with us today. I often tell folks in reflecting on my podcast experiences that at times I approach this endeavor as a personal journey of growth and development. I have long since been a research and learning junkie, and I was recently reflecting on the position I find myself in now. Where else, I ask myself, could I ask a question of or have a conversation with thought leaders from around the world in various criminology-related fields? I mean, I used to read books and articles on the topic of desistance from crime, for example. But never in my wildest dreams did I ever imagine that a mechanism would be in place which would allow me, for example, to ask Fergus McNeil or Shad Maruna a question I have as to the topic of desistance. I pinch myself, quite frankly, wondering if I'm living in an adult learner's dream. Or, for example, for as long as I can remember, I've always loved all things related to mafia and organized crime content. And lo and behold, a few weeks back, I find myself speaking with Dr. Anna Sergi, a world-renowned expert on Italian organized crime. That interview led me to crossing paths with my next very special guest. Dr. Vincent Figliomeni is director at Francesco Figliomeni Social Science Research Center in Calabria, Italy. One of his many specialties is the study of Italian organized crime, specifically the 'Ndrangheta. He is going to share with us his unique educational and vocational trajectory, which is fascinating, trust me. I am so very pleased to be able to share with you all my recent conversation with Dr. Vincent Figliomeni. Please enjoy this enlightening interview, and I will see you all on the other side. Well, welcome to the show, Dr. Figliomeni. Why don't we start off by you just kind of tell our audience about yourself, generally speaking, a little bit about your background, both educationally and professionally.
Okay, well, Joe, first of all, it's good to be here, and thank you very much for allowing me the opportunity to speak to your audience. I'm a PhD in criminology, and that is a long road to explain, so I'm going to try to do it briefly. I'm a retired Army officer. Now, I entered the military, the U.S. Army, many decades ago. And I ended up into the military police corps, where I obtained many experiences and adventures and opportunities in law enforcement, corrections, and so forth. And I did that via a master's degree at the University of Iowa, a master's degree in criminal justice and corrections. So the Army did it right. Yeah, they got a guy that actually was qualified to do the job and put him in there. So I went off and went to a couple of different continents. And fast forward later, I found an opportunity to obtain also a qualification as a public affairs officer and knocked out a master's degree in journalism and mass communications. achieving the maximum amount of credentials in terms of public affairs for the Defense Department. And then I went on to do other things in my military experience that I found was, all along, everything I did from a practical point of view, I found myself, I have either studied it or was going to study it. So that's what kept me going back and forth between academia and the practical side of being a practitioner in all senses of the word, not only in criminal justice but also in mass communications analysis and so forth. I went on to do work as a civilian. When I retired, I elected to retire from the military while I was in Italy. So it was a pretty good opportunity for a guy like me with a Italian-American background. And found myself an opportunity also to continue on with my passion in law enforcement and security and global security with a PhD in criminology at the University of Trento. So that's kind of a long road to why I call myself a criminologist today. And how my military background, my civilian background with the Army and the Navy, by the way, which we'll discuss later, all ties into a practitioner having the opportunity to use academics as a tool in order to move forward in making what I think are significant contributions to the field.
And I appreciate that. And I appreciate, as you noted, you really leverage that education and experience, which we're going to talk about how that manifested itself in a lot of your work, up to and including several of your publications. Now, to be clear for our audiences, you are calling in, so to speak, this afternoon from Italy. You are residing now in Italy, correct? How long has that been the case?
Yeah, well, coincidentally, this is the 30th year of consecutive presence in the country of Italy. Now, I had another tour of duty for 3 years, which might sound insignificant, but it's where I met my wife and, where my whole life came together. So that's cool, kind of significant to me. But in any case, I've been here for 30 consecutive years. And again, it's all been about jumping in back and forth between opportunities that the military or the civilian arm of the Defense Department, as a senior civilian, which I became, gave me opportunities, and I took them, and we kind of made a nice little thing of it. So I will let you go ahead and lead us on now further into how I think I've contributed in some tangible way to the field.
Well, let's take these in no particular order. You mentioned your experience in the military, both in the U.S. Army and the Navy, which I assume contributed to this first publication I want to talk to you about, Assessment of Maritime Piracy in East Africa, Applications of Rational Choice, Routine Activities, Theory, and Dynamic Operational Design, Planning, and Assessment Approach. Unpack some of that for us. I guess the key takeaway there is maritime piracy in East Africa.
Right. Well, I was assigned as the N9. And they're N codes for the seniors level fleet staff. So like the N2 would be the intelligence officer for the fleet commander. I was the N9, which was the operational assessments director. And so I had an array of naval officers, very competent, and about 12 of them, and some civilians. And what our whole purpose was to look and see everything that the fleet was doing in terms of its efforts to try to improve global security, teaching partner nations to do their own security. It was a security cooperation mission. Do military exercises to improve interoperability among ourselves and other nations. And to be ready for contingency operations, which I actually participated in a couple of occasions. So it was a big job, but it was all about a guy. Now get this. Now here I am, a retired Army officer, right? Military police and a PhD in criminology, and I'm looking at all these things that are happening in the Navy, and I'm saying, hey, okay, here's what you guys need to do to improve. And you know what? The amazing thing was the Navy is so cool. I mean, I found this out later in life, that they accepted, people that give criticism, that have basis for the criticism, they listen. And so my whole purpose was to evaluate all these things that were going on around me. Of course, not everything, but the things that the fleet commander wanted to know about. Are we doing the right things? Are we doing them well? And what do we need to do to improve? And gave me an opportunity to have my guys look at it, because they were the experts. I mean, I had nuclear engineers. I had guys that never. But the thing was, we were taking social science types of tools that I was the guy that had the more experience in, and then we were kind of melding it all together into what they were looking at and how we needed to look at it and how we needed to judge whether or not what we were doing was actually producing the outcomes that the Navy really wanted in those areas of the world. I'm talking about between Africa and Europe, a pretty wide scope of activities that the Navy and the Sixth Fleet, at least, is responsible for. So that's the basis of it. Now, how do I get to routine activities? Well, that's my criminology background. So when I was doing this job, I started to see a pattern. I started to see that the things that we were doing and the things that the international community was doing, and the things that policies that were being created. If you recall, Somalia was the big problem in East Africa. East Africa, the focal point was Somalia. They didn't have a government, but they had an interim government. And so what was happening was, while I was there, just coincidentally, while I was there, that interim government began to create activities and began to do things with their authority they were given by the international community, in concert with the international community, the Maritime Bureau, and some of the other international partners, the NATO presence there with NATO ships. The EU had ships down in East Africa. We're all trying to look at how can you deal with piracy in a more effective way. And in fact, with all those things together, I saw that a routine activities approach was probably the best. Now, let me just give you a brief synthesis on the routine activities approach. You're looking at motivated offenders, you're looking at suitable targets, and you're looking at capable guardians that are absent. Well, if you correct all that, if you try to deal with the motivated offenders and deter them, if you try to make the suitable targets harder, in other words, make them more less penetrable, you're more resistant, and you get those capable guardians out there doing what they need to do to apprehend offenders, well, then you have yourself a situation where maybe you got a chance at deterring the mostly Somali pirates that were operating in East Africa at the time. And so it's much more complicated than that. It's in the book. I explain it in excruciating detail, but in a nutshell, that's what it is. I mean, and it's actually, here's the other thing. It's a good news story that in law enforcement and global security, we don't have many of those. We don't have many times where we can say we all put our heads together, we focused on the problem, we applied solutions, and the outcome was exactly what we wanted, a reduction in maritime piracy in East Africa. Now, on the flip side, the problem, as I predicted in that book, the problem is West Africa. And that's what the second version of my book will be once I get enough time and opportunity to focus on the current situation in West Africa, which is as bad as what was in East Africa, some 8-9 years ago. So that's it in a nutshell, Joe. I hope that helps.
It helped immensely. And I just loved, as I listened to that, Vince, how you were really applying everything you learned on your educational and vocational journey from, applying criminology concepts, for example, to the military issue or the military problem of piracy. And as you said, that template that really worked. Yeah, I just love that. We don't, like you said, see that too often in a lot of what we do in government.
Sure.
Let's segue to your next piece of work here. Again, you noted you've been in Italy now for 30 consecutive years. The public image of the immigrant in Italy, an inquiry into public opinion of immigrant involvement in crime and immigration policy related issues. Let's drill down on that one a little bit, Vince.
Okay, now that's a very, very, very important subject for me personally, because I grew up as an Italian American in the United States, and God loved the United States that they gave me an opportunity to run around telling everybody, "Hey, I'm Italian, man," but at the same time, I'm American. I mean, I'm a retired Army officer, and I put myself on the line in many respects to defend our country, and I'll do it tomorrow if I'm asked to in a heartbeat. But the point is, immigration was a very, very, very personal subject for me. So when I came to Italy, and technically speaking, I'm still an immigrant. I'm an immigrant in Italy. My father, who immigrated from Italy to go to the United States, he was an immigrant in the United States. Me, I came back. I came to Italy, and now I'm an immigrant. I have U.S. citizenship. I don't have Italian citizenship, so I still got to go all through all the bureaucracy to call myself a immigrant, and I'm proud to do it. But the thing is, I saw some things going on with immigration and immigrants, in particular in crime, and the way that the Italians were reporting it. It was great that they were reporting. It was great that they were, but I don't think they really understood that the labeling and all the other things that go along with, policing being concentrated on immigrant communities, and that raises their profile. It raises their amount of arrests. It raises their amount of convictions. And if you don't deal with their problems that they're having to try to integrate into the community, then it's going to continue. So you're always going to say, well, the immigrants are a problem. They're a crime problem. And so I tried to get at that with the Immigrant and Crime book. It happened to be the focal point for my PhD dissertation, which I did at the University of Trento, and then later on the program transferred to Catholic University of Milan. But in any case, I thought, what a waste if I don't look at this in aggregate, some years later. So I did a sort of longitudinal study, and I actually got my kids involved to do telephonic surveys to replicate what I had done some years later in 2004 and 2005. And in 2012, when the second set of data came in, it was quite revealing that everything kind of stayed the same. And I also added respondents not only from the north of Italy, where the original survey was done, but I also added respondents from the south of Italy, so I can get a comparison on the regional points of view on immigrants and crime. And I found that there were some differences in the way that the north looks at immigrants and the south looks at immigrants. But I also found that the reason why the south looks at immigrants a little differently is because their crime problem isn't only about their perception of immigrants; it's about the 'ndrangheta, which we'll segue into your next question. So that's kind of it in a nutshell.
So before we move on from that, what were some of the themes that you learned, or even the thesis of your PhD, as far as that sort of relationship between immigration and crime, and really all about perceptions, I imagine, as well? Yeah.
Well, the Italian population, and if you can generalize from my data set, which pretty decent data set, seemed to state that the Italians have a tolerance for different people. I mean, different cultures. I mean, they're kind of an interesting culture in and of themselves. But they had certain predispositions that I think just to say, without getting into the details, that it's not like they blamed immigrants for the crime problem. It was that, they understood that immigrants had some challenges, okay? But in the end, the immigrants were perceived as being more oriented toward criminal lifestyles. And in the end, I probably should have done a better job of differentiating between those who thought that and those who thought that, perhaps it was just on the surface, just immigrants, crime, that's it. Nothing in between. And so I've done a number of presentations on the topic at other universities, at University of Padua and Catanzaro and some others. And I got those kinds of questions from the students, which is really good to hear that the students are thinking about that kind of thing. But in the end, I think I can safely say that immigrants are perceived as being more involved in crimes. And in fact, they are statistically, but you got to peel back, the onion a little bit, and you got to see what kinds of crimes we're talking about. We're talking about theft crimes. We're talking about crimes that are less violent, I mean, there are sensational cases that have occurred where some immigrant person killed someone in Italy, and it was a big thing. It was a national but in a large part, it's a day-to-day, gotta live and gotta survive kind of crime that the immigrant is involved with. And that was the thing I was really interested in. Do immigrants really, involve themselves in violent types of crime? And the answer was no, not really. And that's what brought me to what I said before about the regional perspectives. In the South, it was like, hell no, they're not that. No, the big problem is the 'ndrangheta, the organized crime guys down here. We got to deal something with that. And it was amazing that I even got those kinds of comments. My kids, who were university students or becoming university students at the time, they were my interviewers because they speak Italian a hell of a lot better than I do. So in the second rendition in the 2012 data set, their understanding of people's reactions and their note taking and so forth was very helpful in understanding those nuances that I have mentioned.
Yeah, and I'm a big data guy, and I just love, as you were speaking there, that folks tend to have these sort of anecdotal perceptions when there's a high profile crime, and they don't really, as you said, peel that onion back. And again, they're letting those emotionally reactive, high profile anecdotal crimes sort of taint their judgment and bias their judgment. So I appreciate that work you did there. Okay. So we teased this a little bit previously. Loyal listeners of the show will know that I recently had on Dr. Anna Sergi on the program, at which time I thought I knew more than the average bear about the mafia and the Cosa Nostra, and she made me aware of this term, 'ndrangheta. Give our listeners some background as to that organized crime referenced, and then, again, feel free to segue right into your book, 'Ndrangheta of Calabria.
Okay, well, the 'ndrangheta is the organized crime element. It's kind of mafia-type organized criminal groups that have evolved in Calabria. And today they're not only in Calabria, they're as Anna had mentioned, and as our research has indicated, they're present in places like Australia, U.S., and Canada, and also in other parts of Europe. This behavioral mafia style, it's a lifestyle, emerges from a long history of southern Italy being sort of the less understood and sort of less dealt with entity of Italy. Now, northern Italy is a very progressive, very modern, different. I've lived all over Italy, so northern Italy, southern Italy, middle Italy, everything in the last 30 years. So, there's some truth to the fact that over the years, from the Risorgimento, which is Italy's reunification, beyond the unification and into its we're talking 150 years ago, that there were bandits in Sicily, and they weren't buying the fact that some dude from forgive my colloquial speak, but some dude from Rome is going to tell them what to do. When they had perfect control of the environment, perfect control of the terrain, they were manipulating the rich blue blood landowners, and they manipulated them right out of their land and taking control by various aspects of their control of the working class people that were just trying to get a plot of land to grow vegetables for the family, et cetera, et cetera. So long story short, that evolution continues into some time in the last 50, 60 years when 'ndrangheta was a rural, not really well-known, mafia-type organized crime entity, while Sicily had the mafia Cosa Nostra and the links and all the hoopla with the United States that is kind of an anomaly that, there is a connection. It's not a direct connection, but there is sort of a cultural connection. But they were getting all the attention. In the 1980s, when anti-mafia prosecutor Judge Falcone and Paolo Borsellino came onto the scene and did the Maxi trials in the 1980s. I was actually in uniform as an MP up in Livorno watching all this from afar and being fascinated by it. If you read, when I get into my book, you'll read part of my book. I dedicate a section to my personal adventure on understanding all this stuff as I was just coming into being on, who am I anyway? Where did I come from? And then I found out that it's got a lot, there was this Drangheta background that was really burning in my heart to understand. So what the Drangheta had done after, let's say, while the Maxi trials were going on in the 1980s and the Italian state was very, very, very seriously going after mafia kingpins, political people that were involved, the whole mix, the Drangheta quietly had their hands in the drug trade, and they were taking more and more over because the mafia was, kind of on its heels and backed in a corner by law enforcement. And the Drangheta kind of came of age and dispensed with its rural. Now, wait a minute, no, I shouldn't say dispensed with. Transformed its rural deep roots into the local environment and made them a vehicle for transformation using the global drug trade of cocaine, which was the drug of choice from 1990s on. And you all know this from the United States because we're a high consumer and have been a high consumer of that unfortunate distribution of illegal drugs. So the Drangheta started making mega bucks, and what they did was they did it quietly, and they did it without making a whole lot of noise with other international partners. They came back and took the proceeds from their earnings and reinvested them into the local environment, but for their own interests. So they were becoming power brokers in their own right in terms of the amount of money that they had to spend and where they would spend it. And they were the absolute authority on what would happen in a community. So they become a parallel system of authority. Now what I'm telling you now, I've touched on it in the book that we'll mention here right now, but I'm writing another book on how that whole process has occurred through their very powerful criminal subculture and the awareness that people who understand them acquiesce, or whether they're involved actively or whether they acquiesce because they're afraid. It's the same thing. The outcome's the same. They get what they want. Okay? So the book that I wrote that was published in 2019 was a pragmatic approach to confronting Drangheta, organized crime of Calabria. And why do I say pragmatic approach? Because I took the tools of our trade, and the criminologist in me said, look, let alone the deep origins of how these guys came to being and how they operate, and let's look at what they do. And the crimes that they're committing, very complex, very elaborate, requiring lots of corruption, lots of payoffs, lots of people that are involved deeply and I'm talking about like personally devoted to the outcomes of the clan that they belong to. And why? Because many of them are related. Many of them are cousins. They're friends from lifelong friends. And many of them have been in this business for as many years as I mentioned, for 100 years or so. These people have been involved in this. And so they find ways to get others involved, whether it's, direct membership or it's just, a facilitator or someone who just goes along because you know what will happen to you if you don't. And it goes on. And so the Drangheta that I describe in the pragmatic approach uses situational crime prevention. As I said, sort of a similar approach to what I used in the assessment of maritime piracy. But in this respect, I create a table, or I would say a template for looking at these crimes and saying, okay, let's take the port of Gioia Tauro, the focal point for the global distribution of cocaine. I mean, it's right up the street. It's like 30 kilometers from me right now. And I'm sitting in the epicenter of Drangheta. Believe me. Tell me, they know I'm here. Well, I'm okay so far, but I don't talk about them personally. I don't mention names. I talk in generic terms from a sociological and criminological kind of point of view. But they operate the port of Gioia Tauro, and the port of Gioia Tauro is a key element for them to bring drugs in and distribute them globally. And so what I take the book to do is apply the situational crime prevention and the models that I have presented, and I use something that I learned in the Navy, by the way, something that I did while I was doing assessments for the Navy, which was dynamic design operational assessment approach. And what that does is it kind of puts everything in a framework where you say, look, are we doing the right things? Are we doing them the right way? And if we're not, let's get to do what? In order to interdict, in order to stop the opportunity from being available to them, in order to take the willingness of people to do this and create a real deterrent, to take policies and make those policies make it really, really difficult for the 'Ndrangheta to carry out, the kinds of behind the scenes corruption that needs to take place in order for them to be successful in these very complex organized criminal operations. So that in a nutshell is the book on 'Ndrangheta. And I will tell you about the one that I'm working on if you are interested, either in this broadcast or maybe in a subsequent one. It's up to you.
Well, let's do both. Let's tease that during this episode, and then I was going to ask you to return, and you just committed to me that you will return, Vince. So yeah, we'll have you back to talk about the book. But yeah, let's tease it. I want to add real quick, when you were speaking and using the the analogy of somebody saying, well, I'm not going to listen to somebody in Rome tell me X, Y, and Z. I thought to myself, so that for our U.S. audience is similar to nobody in Washington, D.C. is going to tell me how my school board should teach my kids or how my tax dollars should be spent. So that sounds like a global phenomenon of local control versus centralized control. Yeah, let's tease that next book, if you don't mind, Vince. I could talk to you all day, but I want to save something to talk about in the future. So yeah, let's talk about that follow-up book real quick.
Okay, well, the follow-up book takes a little more of I want to call it, forgive me, it's a high road only in terms of taking the opinions and the very in-depth studies that have been done by the classic sociologists, primarily of the Chicago School. Back when immigration in the United States was at its high point, and they fleshed out a lot of real practical kinds of observations that I think are applicable today. Talcott Parsons and Robert Merton and some of the others that have looked at and then we get into the 60s, and you got Cloward Nolan and some of the others that did gang analysis, Albert Cohen. I mean, I could go on and on and on. And what I discovered is I was going through, and some of the stuff I hadn't looked at in a lot of years. I mean, I've been busy being a practical guy. My theoretical basic background was, a little rusty, so I had to go back and do a little relearning. And what I discovered was all of the things that were bothering me in my mind about, why can't we just follow that line between how this thing happens and what are the key elements that make it so an organization that's not even an organization, it's a bunch of, individual operating cooperatively clans in southern Italy, what makes them so successful? Because they are successful. What makes it happen? Well, I took that line from, the sociologists who talked about deviants and talked about the deviants who find themselves in situations where, as a group, a small group, albeit, they react, and they react against the main group. Why? Well, because they're not getting what they want from the main group. So you can talk about, Merton's, let me put it in real basic terms, the search for the American dream. So you got some bunch of guys that from some other country, and they got a gang. And why they got a gang? Because they feel like they belong to something. Because why? Because they don't have an education. The cops are always after them. They don't have a real strong background in education and so forth. So they're not going to make it the right way. I got to do it the legitimate way. And if they try, they're going to get blocked because of some other, obstacles. And so they end up acting out in their, young years. And then that grows into, so think about the gangs that emerged in the 1920s, the Al Capones and the whole bunch of the five families on there. Yes, I mean, this thing is applicable, I think, in that regard, quite clearly to a United States audience. But when I think about it in Italy, I said, no, that didn't happen. Italy's Italy. I mean, Calabria is part of Italy, and that's the end of it. Well, no, not really, because you start digging deep and start probing into, is Calabria really, a region that is given the complete and appropriate emphasis that it needs? No. I mean, there are limited trains that come down here. The infrastructure here is for COVID. Let me just use COVID as a recent example. COVID levels when they coded, whether or not you were at risk or a red zone, very bad, everybody just stay home. Wasn't because of the COVID virus being rampant down here. No, it was because the health system wasn't able to take care of people if they did. There was a limited, 10 beds in one place and, 30 beds in another, and for acute care, for intensive care. And that's why they were coded red. So all these things that I saw in the last 30 years, having come down here, routinely, it started adding up my madness. The reason is these people are marginalized. They've been that way for a very long time. And they're kind of like, I don't want to say any state in the United States, but just think of yourself to a state in the United States where the roads are still dirt, and there are a lot of places you just can't get to very easily, and they've just been kind of neglected. Well, welcome to Calabria, because that's what you'll find here for the most part. And that, I think, drove folks that were here to see that, okay, wait, I want to be an honest citizen. I want to go do something nice. So, we'll do something honest. I want to educate myself and have a family. What do they go? What do? They leave. Most of the young people from Calabria, the young people that, want to educate themselves, they leave. And the ones that just want to get a job, they leave. Why? Because there's no opportunity here. And, the meritocracy doesn't exist because why? Who's behind this? Who's behind the curtain? Who's the guy behind the curtain? It's the Drangheta. They control everything. So the parallel system of authority that I talked about becomes a mechanism for people. You go, if you want a job, you want your child to have it, or your son, daughter, to have a job after they get out of whatever university or whatever they're doing. If you go to them, chances are they're going to give you a job. But you have to think about the consequences of what that entails. So
I'm so glad you go ahead, Vince.
Go ahead. No. That's it. It's very complicated, and the book will explain all that. But that's just a preview to how mind-boggling this thing can be when you start talking about. Let me add one thing, because I think this is probably appropriate. Until now, the Drangheta has had a very good situation, because when their people are arrested, when their people are incarcerated, they don't talk. It's called omerta. Okay, they don't speak. You keep quiet, you do your time, and that's the end of it. You don't turn on the family. You don't turn on. This is not Godfather stuff. I'm talking your real family, your real one. Your cousins, everybody that's still doing that stuff that you were doing, they're going to get caught if you talk. So you don't talk. So when you get out, you get taken care of and all the rest. Well, recently, in the last couple of years, a prosecutor by the name of Gratteri has been operating in southern Italy. And he's from actually the mountaintop that I see from my house over here. He's got quite a lot of courage, and he's taken these guys on. He's taken on the Drangheta, and he's created what's called the Maxi trials, Rinascita Scott. And I'm also going to do a piece on that, do a write-up on that as well. So that might be of interest to you. And what it is 400 plus people that have been arrested and been charged with crimes, a criminal association, mafia type association, they're Drangheta. And there are 58 registered informants among them. Yes, exactly. And so that's the key. So you got something that's happened here that very much a little bit like what happened in Sicily some 20 some years ago, but now in Calabria, which was thought to be impenetrable, you got now. Here's another thing. I am an optimist, but I'm also a realist, and I know that of these 58 people, they're trying to get a reduced sentence, and they're trying to do the best they can to fare for themselves. Okay, so do I think that these 58 people are going to take down the entire network of a Drangheta? No, absolutely not. I do not think that at all. I do think that there'll be a lot that we can learn from this, and I do think that it's one step kind of in my pragmatic approach methodology that I mentioned earlier, that, hey, you can learn from this, and now let's do something a little different over here and over here and over here and over here in order to get the results that we want long term, because it's going to be a long-term battle, because this stuff is not just a bunch of guys involved in crime. It is a cultural thing. It's a mafia behavioral thing. It's a thing that the good people in the population are also very much in tune. They don't accept it. Many, about 99% don't want any of this stuff. But because it comes from the cultural experience of being kind of sort of marginalized and, the things that got to be done in order, the state just doesn't produce in the way that it really, I think, should. And so what you get is you got people that, well, this doesn't work this way, we'll try it that way. And that way that I'm talking about is the illegal way. And so that's where these guys have a market on, you want to get what you want to get, come see us, and then we own you.
I'm so glad you brought up Robert Merton earlier when you were describing your experiences with, not your experiences, but sort of the haves and have-nots, and you cited the U.S. experience in the 1920s with the immigrants, which, correct me if I'm wrong, but you were articulating strain theory there, which, again, I love, because I try to tell practitioners, if you understand the theoretical underpinnings, it doesn't matter if you're looking at piracy in East Africa, the Indradika, or local youths in local street gangs, or someone on your probation caseload. Again, roll up your sleeves and recall those theorists, because, again, it'll help you apply it in however you like. And you've showed us a great illustration here, Vince, of how you've leveraged your criminology background, your military background, arguably your cultural background, and we've got some great outputs here. I just cannot thank you enough for sharing all this. Well, Dr. Vincent Figliomeni, we can't thank you enough for your time. I will hold you to coming back on the show, because I am really curious about that next book coming out. Any other future projects you've got going on? I will make sure I leave the link you sent me with all of your publications in the show notes of this episode. So if anybody is interested and they didn't scribble those down in time, I will leave the details of all of Vince's publications, at least the three we talked about on the show, in the episode description of this podcast episode. Vince, anything else on the horizon for you or your family over there in Italy?
The Maxi trials that I mentioned, the Rinascita Scott, named after a U.S. law enforcement officer, by the way, that was killed in an unrelated sort of situation that Prosecutor Gratteri knew. That trial itself is still ongoing. It's been ongoing since earlier this year. It probably will take it through this entire calendar year and into the next year. But what I'm interested in is doing the analysis on the types of sentencing that comes out of that, and any outcomes on the informants, and what kinds of nuances that occur from a very first time sort of event for the 'Ndrangheta to have so many people willing to talk to law enforcement about the 'Ndrangheta in a way that may have a negative impact on 'Ndrangheta operations and 'Ndrangheta in general. But again, I'm an optimist, but I'm also a realist, so I think that they're going to be around for a while. It's going to take a long time to get it done. The other book that I'm going to be rewriting, it's not even a rewrite, it's really a new book that's going to take the same approach that I took to maritime piracy in East Africa and apply to West Africa, because that seems to be the problem spot today. So those are the two initiatives that I have that I'll be working on in the next coming months and probably into the next year.
Dr. Vincent Figliomeni, thank you so much for your time. We look forward to having you back on the show. Be well, friend.
Okay, you too. Thanks, Joe. I appreciate it, and say hello to everybody out there in Minnesota.
I will. Thank you.
But go Hawkeyes.
Okay, go Hawks. A huge criminologist thank you once again to Vince for that fantastic interview. I noted at the beginning of this episode that a fringe benefit for me producing this podcast is that I get to meet and chat with some amazing people from around the world, some of which I have continued to have dialogue with post-podcast production. And I have a feeling Vince will be one of those individuals. At the conclusion of recording his interview, Vince stayed on the line over there in Calabria, and we talked and chatted on a variety of topics. At one point, I mentioned to him that my grandfather was from Italy and that his family hailed from the town of Cosenza, to which Vince replied, "Oh yeah, right up the road here in Calabria." So, small world, mother, if you are listening, and great to make that awesome Italian connection, Vince. Hey, we've got some fantastic guests coming up. Friend of the show, Dr. Jared Brown, will be back next week. We are going to talk about autism in the criminal justice system. The next week, my very special scheduled guest is Brian Lovins. If you know Brian, you know that's going to be a great, great interview. And we've got a very special guest lined up in the weeks ahead. I don't want to jinx it, but risk needs responsivity fanatics, you are going to want to catch this episode for sure. In the meantime, you may contact the show or reach out to us through our website, theparagongroup.llc.com, for training or presentations as to evidence-based practices, or, of course, the topic of desistance from crime. If you have questions or comments as to this podcast, feel free to contact the show via our email at thecriminologistpodcast@gmail.com. That's thecriminologistpodcast@gmail.com. Remember to follow us through our Facebook page and our Instagram page at The Criminologist Podcast. New fun images are being added all the time to those feeds. You don't want to miss out. Criminologist Media Group is also on Twitter. You can follow us at Crim Media Group. That's CRIM Media Group. Go ahead and give us a follow. You can connect with me, Joseph Arvidsson, on LinkedIn, and follow both the Criminologist Podcast and the Paragon Group on our LinkedIn pages. And lastly, if you've not already done so, check out and subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Criminologist, for additional content as to the themes of this podcast. Hey, merchandise is available. We've got some fridge magnets in, some criminologist pens in, so reach out to the show if you would like some merchandise. And if you believe in what we're doing on the show, if you're part of the movement, please spread the word, tell a friend or a coworker or a colleague about us, ask them to subscribe to the show, and of course, do so yourself if you've not already done so. And always remember, folks, there's no them, there's only us.
Ndrangheta was a rural, not really well-known, mafia-type organized crime entity. While Sicily had the Mafia Cosa Nostra and the links and all the hoopla with the United States, that is kind of an anomaly that, you know, there is a connection. It's not a direct connection, but there is sort of a cultural connection.
The Criminologist Podcast is a production of the Paragon Group, LLC. For speaking engagements, interviews, program design, or training opportunities, please visit us at theparagongroup.llc.com. If you enjoyed the show, you can find more content and videos on our YouTube channel, The Criminologist. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Both the Criminologist Podcast and the Criminologist channel are brought to you by the Criminologist Media Group. Be sure to give us a 5-star review, and thanks for listening.
The thoughts, statements, and opinions of the host and cast members do not necessarily reflect the views of their employers and are those of the host and cast themselves. Any discussion regarding client statements, behaviors, actions, or crimes are purely fictional and are used only for the purposes of example. Any examples that could be deemed to be related to an actual individual or individuals are incidental.